The Great FPS Divide is something that you may or may not actually be aware of. I'm not talking about frames per second, but first-person shooters. There is a gigantic gap, a chasm that splits the genre in half. And I'm not talking about single or multiplayer, no, that's actually irrelevant. That's a way of presenting the content. I'm talking about the mechanics of these games. And you may say to yourself, well, yeah, of course, there's a divide. There's realistic games like Battlefield and more arcadey shooter games like Call of Duty. No, again, that's not the divide I'm referring to. It's perhaps a smaller divide, a little tiny itsy-bitsy rift. The divide I'm referring to separates games into two categories. Two that are so distinct that if someone excels at one, they may outright suck at the other. And I'll give you probably the best example I can. I'm an okay Unreal Tournament player. I handle myself well enough in the game. I am not a good Counter-Strike player, because those games, even though they are first-person shooters, both of them, they are fundamentally different. That's where the divide comes in. A long time ago, you see, first-person shooters worked on a very different system than they do now. You had games like Doom that didn't actually require that much in terms of aiming or calculating trajectories for weapons. They just worked on the idea that, hey look, the enemy is approximately in front of you, so when you're gonna fire, you're gonna hit. That was a limitation of the technology. It was kind of hit scan back then. Well, not actually hit scan because it's sort of the primitive version of hit scan, not the one we have now. But then something interesting happened. Quake happened. Quake was a unique game for its time. Well, as unique as games can get. Quite frankly, I should have started this off with Ultima Underworld, because that's the reason we have a lot of the games we do today the way we do today. Element 222. Ultima Underworld had projectiles. Slow moving, not really all that fun to use projectiles. You would fire them, you would see them fly off, even the spells, even those had projectiles, and you would see them crash into something. You could miss, the thing you shot at could move out of the way because it had a lot of time, honestly. If I remember right, and I'm probably not, I once dodged an arrow trap. I think it was in Ultima Underworld 2. It was that Qbert puzzle. Was it 1 or 2? So somewhere around that puzzle in the real world, not the... Yeah, I think it was 1. I dodged an arrow trap because the arrow was moving slow enough for me to dodge it. That game had projectile-based weapons, but they were slow. They were not that interesting to use. They were nowhere near as fun as Doom's rocket launcher or Doom's shotgun. And then, like I said, Quake happened. Quake could do projectiles in real time at a high enough efficiency that it actually made it fun to play. Most of the projectiles in Doom, I'm not entirely sure if the shotguns were using modeled ammo, like modeled projectiles, but just about every other weapon had projectiles. Projectiles that you would see being fired from your gun and that you would see are hitting the enemy. And that's when they would do damage. Not before, not after, but on impact. Now this kind of approach to creating an FPS brought about a plethora of new gameplay mechanics, of ways to create an FPS. And that spawned into things like Quake 2, it spawned into Quake 3, and it spawned into Unreal Tournament. Now these games had a lot of physics-based weapons. They had things like the flak cannon that used very small projectiles that would bounce off walls and hit you or the enemy. You still had hit scan stuff like the Enforcer and I believe the minigun, and the shock rifle was instant hit it. Yeah, it was hit scan in its primary fire, but still the secondary fire was not hit scan. You had to aim it, it had to go there, you could explode that big ball of plasma in the air and kill everyone, and it had the rocket launcher. I'm gonna come back to this weapon in a few moments. Quake, on the other hand, had its fair share of weapons that required a high degree of accuracy. Its rocket launcher fired just one rocket. It had no side option to turn into a grenade or to hold the target on the enemy and wait for it to lock on. It didn't have those area of effect things that would allow you to compensate for your lack of ability to aim or to accurately predict where the enemy will be. Unreal Tournament's rocket launcher could fire 6 rockets at a time or could fire 6 grenades. Now even though these are both elements of physics calculation. Like, they're not hit scan. You have to calculate where that projectile is gonna be, where the player is gonna be, if they're both gonna be close to each other when one blows up in order to do damage. Even though they are both based on the same idea, they handle things differently enough in such a way that being good at Unreal Tournament doesn't actually mean you're gonna be good at Quake. This is where the divide sort of started, because even though Unreal Tournament has weapons like the sniper rifle, which is similar to the railgun, or it has the shock rifle, which again is similar to the railgun, and it does have the rocket launcher, and it does have the flag cannon. They sort of drifted into two different directions. And that drift continued as more games were released that piled on one side or the other. You had games with all sorts of special abilities and attacks and things that would make everything blow up that anyone can play. Like, you don't have to be a god of aiming to play Overwatch. It helps with some characters like Widowmaker, but you can enjoy it greatly by just getting a character that can spam a certain attack or doesn't require that fine of an aim. Team Fortress 2 is another good example. You can play the Pyro, which doesn't require aim. You can play the Heavy, which doesn't require that much aiming. You can play the Medic. You can play... Well, honestly, not even the Soldier requires that much aiming because the Rocket has a very high impact radius, the Demo Man as well, the Scout as well. The Sniper is the only one that actually requires any sort of precision, and it's really not that difficult to play with them. And on the other side of the divide, you have games like Counter-Strike Go, you have games like Battlefield, even games like Call of Duty that require a certain level of aiming, specifically aim down sights most of the time. It sort of tries to get the player into that frame of mind that you have to be precise, you have to have the weapon exactly over the target in order for it to do the damage you want to. These aren't games where you can fire a Reaper 10 times in a room and let God sort them out, and God would usually sort them out with beheadings. Yours too if you stuck around there for too long. And here's the funny bit. A lot of the games on this side of the Great FPS Divide, games that would seem to focus more on realism, aren't at all realistic. Call of Duty isn't, Counter-Strike isn't. Battlefield tries. Battlefield actually tries to emulate bullet fall off, it actually tries to emulate all sorts of things. So it's a bit more realistic. It leans a bit more to the Arma simulator model. The other ones don't. The other ones are just framing a hit scan model in a more realistic-ish approach, trying to instill in the player the idea that correct aim is the best approach. And yet, these games, especially Counter-Strike Go, adds a lot of fake recoil. While yes, they do try and model that recoil after real weapons, well, they tried at one time to model that recoil after the real counterparts of those weapons. You can probably see that they've changed them so much now that they probably don't resemble that realistic model that much. They mostly reflect how good that weapon was compared to the others, tweaking the fake recoil up until it's more in line with everything else and not above everything guaranteed. So it's not a perfect weapon that everyone should use, and if you don't, you lose automatically. Even though, well, basically they're all the same weapon. The fake recoil, the damage, and well, the penetration would be the only elements that make them stand out from each other. Yeah, there will be the magazine size as well, but they're still basically the same weapon. They don't have, how shall I put this, different firing modes that make them unique. They're just guns. And that's okay, because the system works. Counter-Strike Go works. It's a very popular game, people like it. I wish I was better at it, but I'm not, because, well, I don't necessarily get along with those hit scan fake recoil weapons. What I do get along with is manipulating the enemy into being where I want them to be in 2 or 3 seconds. That's something that I can use to my advantage in a game that actually uses projectiles. It actually uses things like grenades. Well, yeah, CSGO has a grenade, but that's not really that useful. I enjoy more games where I can use my rocket launcher to bounce a grenade off a wall and behind cover. I like games where I can just make a plasma burst on the other side of a wall and take out 2 enemies. Now, although games like these may seem a bit more chaotic, they also require about the same amount of skill as something like CSGO does. Like, probably even more, because these games don't factor recoil in that much, and that's because movement is one of the central elements of these kind of games. And I know, it was in Quake 3 as well. Movement in Quake 3 was very important. So the Divide was sort of... how should I put this? Quake 3 and Unreal Tournament were sort of superimposed at an angle, like right at the center of the Divide. And from them there spawned those two genres, those diverging genres of games. Well, sure, there was Half-Life by then already, so you could put Half-Life somewhere around there too, because Half-Life had a lot of crazy weapons. Half-Life had weapons that were bugs, no, I believe. Was Half-Life the one with the bug weapon, or was it opposing force? Never mind. It still had rocket launchers and all sorts of stuff that was very interesting to use. But beyond them, games really diverged to the point where they're kind of incompatible with each other. It's quite interesting to see how these two approaches to making an FPS have evolved over time, and how the design has changed quite a lot. Up until Overwatch and the new era of a bajillion clones of TF2 came out, there weren't a lot of games that used the idea of let's put together a lot of random weapons with random effects so big, so explosive, some of them hit scan, a lot of them not, and let's see what sticks. No balancing necessary. Everybody leaned more towards the let's make things a bit more realistic, let's have aim down sights, let's pretend to have actual ballistics trajectories, or let's try to simulate them a bit and not actually let you shoot like 5 missiles at a time at the entire room and see everyone die. But now it's honestly quite nice to see that both of these styles are being catered to, so everyone can enjoy something, even in the same FPS. That's why I like games like Overwatch. They cater to so many styles in the same game, whereas something like Counter-Strike limits itself because it needs a lot of balancing to do something very simplistic. And yet it can still achieve success, whereas something like Shootmania Storm, which was also highly simplistic, you had one gun at a time, you had maybe 3 guns in the entire game that all shot the same projectile, that all worked more or less the same, that you couldn't even change on a whim. I believe in the top 10 players in the country at one time, though to be fair, probably 10 people had the game back then. That was also a game that was made to be an esport, that was made to be balanced to the bone, and yet it failed. It failed miserably, possibly because it required that idea of aim where the player will be. Not a lot of esports are actually based on this idea anymore. Quake 3 was, I guess, the last one. Now it's all based on how quickly can you aim at where the player is, or approximately where he is. I was actually a bit surprised to see that Shootmania still works. Well, it has one server left in the entire world, but hey, it still works. So, which kind of FPS do you like best? The ones where you can shoot a lot of weapons that do a lot of physical based stuff, or the ones where you can quickscope 360? Looking forward to the comments. If you enjoyed this show, hit the like button, subscribe and share it with your friends. Or, if you thought it was horrible, then share it with your enemies and make them suffer. We shall be your weapon of vengeance. But if you liked what you saw, you could, I don't know, maybe donate, because basically YouTube is horrible at revenue, by using the link in the description, or just buy my book. It's a fantasy book about, well, a lot of stuff. I guarantee it won't suck, and if it does suck, you can find me here and complain about it.